Plato, born in Athens around 427 BCE, is often remembered as the father of Western philosophy. But here's the surprise. Plato wasn't exactly a fan of marriage. In fact, in his famous dialogue, The Republic, when he describes his ideal state, marriage and the private family nearly vanish, at least for the ruling class. Plato argued that the guardians of society, the philosopher kings and their warrior companions, shouldn't get entangled in private households. Why? Because loyalty to spouse and children creates divided interests. Instead, guardians should devote themselves fully to justice and the common good. In his model, children would be raised communally, not even knowing which parent was theirs. It sounds shocking today, but for Plato, it meant a society free from jealousy, inheritance disputes, and favoritism. Marriage, then, was not a romantic bond. It was a state-controlled partnership, arranged to produce healthy children and strengthen the city. Love and personal passion were suspect, distractions from truth. To later thinkers, Plato's ideas sounded cold, even dystopian. But for him, abolishing traditional marriage among elites was radical social engineering, designed to keep virtue, not family pride, at the center of politics. Plato's Republic still sparks debate today. Was he a genius visionary or an overbearing utopian who sacrificed love at the altar of philosophy?
Aristotle, born in 384 BCE, was Plato's brightest student, but with his own very different vision of society. Unlike Plato, who imagined abolishing families for rulers, Aristotle thought family life was natural within the city. Yet his version of marriage was far from romantic. For Aristotle, everything in nature had a hierarchy, and he placed men at the top. He described women bluntly as incomplete men, naturally suited to obey rather than rule. That view made conjugal life feel like a one-sided duty, the husband as rational governor, the wife as subordinate partner. Marriage, therefore, wasn't about love or passion. It was about producing children and securing property. Romance was unstable, even dangerous. It distracted from reason and order. While he saw friendship as a noble bond, marital romance didn't qualify as true equality. This cold functional framework influenced centuries of Western thought. It justified patriarchal systems and kept marriage tied to duty, inheritance, and hierarchy rather than love. Today, Aristotle is criticized for reducing women and marriage itself to mere social tools. He remains one of the clearest examples of philosophy stripping marriage of emotion and redefining it simply as civic obligation.
Epicurus, born in 341 BCE, preached a philosophy that shocked many. True happiness came not from wealth, power, or passion, but from tranquil simplicity, what he called ataraxia, freedom from disturbance. So where did marriage fit into this vision? Nowhere essential. Epicurus taught that family life usually burdened people with stress, jealousy, finances, endless conflicts. While he didn't outright ban marriage, he strongly suggested that those seeking peace should avoid it, unless special circumstances made it pleasant. Instead, Epicurus promoted friendships as the highest human bond. Friends could bring joy without the chains of obligation and endless drama he saw in marriage. For him, pleasures should be chosen carefully. Small meals, conversation, contemplation. A peaceful mind was preferable to romance's roller coaster. Critics often dismissed him as promoting selfish withdrawal, but his advice had wide appeal, especially for people exhausted by political and social turmoil in Athens. Epicurus left behind a philosophy that still sounds modern. Avoid toxic entanglements, cultivate mental calm, and don't let marriage turn life into a battleground.
Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher and advisor to Emperor Nero, lived in the 1st century CE. His life was dramatic: exile, power, and eventually ordered suicide, but his philosophy preached detachment. Central to Stoicism was freedom from destructive emotions. For Seneca, passion, whether anger, lust, or romantic obsession, chained people to suffering. Marriage, often fueled by these passions, looked like a trap. Instead of tranquility, it produced jealousy, anxiety, and loss of independence. In his letters and essays, Seneca praised self-control, simple living, and focusing on virtue over desire. He argued that craving love or clinging to a partner meant surrendering your inner freedom. True wisdom meant being, quote, content with yourself without needing anyone else. Though Stoics did marry, Seneca's stance on detachment made him skeptical of marriage's constant emotional storms. Ironically, he himself was married, but his writings idealized a level of restraint few spouses would find endearing. Seneca's stance remains controversial. Was he warning humanity about real dangers of obsessive love, or stripping life of one of its deepest joys? His words still echo for those torn between passion and peace.
Tertullian, a Christian writer from Carthage in the late 2nd and early 3rd century CE, has been called the father of Latin theology. But when it came to marriage, his words were anything but fatherly. In works like On Exhortation to Chastity, Tertullian argued that marriage was not a blessing, but a trap. To him, wedlock piled up burdens and sins. He praised celibacy as the holier path, calling chastity a spiritual safeguard in a world filled with temptation. For Tertullian, every family tie chained the soul to worldly anxieties, children, finances, desire. The true believer was meant to live free for God alone. If marriage did happen, in his view, it should be constant self-discipline, not pleasure. This radical take reflected early Christianity's tension with Roman culture, which glorified family, legacy, and heirs. Later church fathers softened this sharp anti-marriage stance, recognizing marriage as a sacrament, but Tertullian's firebrand writing left an imprint, the idea that matrimony can distract from spiritual purity. To admirers, he defended radical devotion. To critics, he reduced human love to sin. His stance on marriage shows how religion and asceticism once forged a philosophy of renunciation over romance.
Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century Prussian philosopher, is famous for his critique of pure reason and his stern ethical system known as the categorical imperative. But when he turned to marriage, the tone didn't get warmer. It got colder. For Kant, marriage wasn't about passion or romance. He described it in the Metaphysics of Morals as a contract of reciprocal possession. In blunt terms, marriage is two partners giving each other lawful rights over each other's bodies. To modern ears, that sounds less like love than like a business merger. Why so clinical? Kant believed human dignity required strict rules. Sexual desire uncontrolled degraded people. Only marriage, in his moral system, could make sexuality lawful and rational. But in stripping marriage of romance, he left it resembling a duty-bound legal exchange instead of a celebration of love. Unlike Rousseau's sentimentalism or romantic ideals later in the 19th century, Kant saw attachment as secondary. For him, the real achievement was regulating passion through reason. Today, Kant's marriage theory feels famously unromantic, reducing love to paperwork with moral overtones. Still, his view shaped centuries of legal and religious thought about matrimony, an institution less about feelings than about order, law, and control.
Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century German pessimist, believed life itself was mostly suffering, and marriage was Exhibit A. Never married himself, he described matrimony as two people trying to solve problems together which they would never have had if alone. For Schopenhauer, nature's cruel trick was the will to life, the blind drive to reproduce. Love and romance were just illusions to lure humans into producing children, after which the bond soured. Husbands, he warned, ended up shackled by money worries and nagging, wives by disillusionment and lost beauty. His essay On Women went even further, depicting women as shallow and manipulative, views shockingly misogynistic even in his own day. For him, marriage handed men a lifetime of servitude and destroyed freedom. And yet, Schopenhauer's bleak honesty made him oddly popular. To many frustrated bachelors, he voiced what they whispered in private. He saw marriage not as noble commitment, but as nature's prison. His influence was wide. Nietzsche admired then rejected him. Freud absorbed his ideas about unconscious drives, and modern cynics still quote his biting lines on love. Schopenhauer's marriage philosophy lives on as perhaps history's most savage philosophical rant against romance itself.
Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844, is famous for proclaiming God is dead and smashing moral certainties. He also smashed the dream of marriage. Though he proposed several times, famously to Lou Salome, he was rejected, and perhaps for good reason. Nietzsche saw marriage as a trap where creativity and freedom suffocated. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he warned that marrying often meant trading your higher calling for routine, jealousy, and compromise. For him, the great individual, the prophet, the artist, the philosopher, needed solitude and struggle, not domestic life. He even advised, quote, "Go to women, don't forget the whip." A shocking metaphorical line, but packed with contempt for romantic illusions. Nietzsche equated marriage with mediocrity, the demand to reproduce, to serve convention, to abandon one's will to power. By contrast, celibacy and solitude cleared the path for greatness. Of course, Nietzsche himself lived in severe loneliness, suffering illness and mental collapse. But his fierce rejection of marriage inspired generations of artists who saw matrimony as surrender. To this day, Nietzsche sits as philosophy's great radical bachelor, declaring that genius must walk alone, free from the chains of spouse, family, and society's expectations.
Leo Tolstoy, the 19th century Russian novelist of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, wasn't just a literary giant, he was also a man tormented by contradictions. Early in life, Tolstoy indulged in gambling, drinking, and womanizing. Later, he renounced his past and embraced radical Christian moralism. That shift included a shocking rejection of sex in marriage. Married to Sofia Andreevna for nearly 50 years, their union produced 13 children but was famously bitter. Tolstoy kept a detailed diary of his past affairs, even showing it to her. The result was years of resentment, fighting, and misery. By his old age, he came to believe that marriage dragged people into lust, jealousy, and spiritual decay. In essays such as the Kreutzer Sonata, Tolstoy thundered that sex, even in wedlock, was immoral. He preached chastity as the highest calling, treating romantic love not as noble, but as a disguise for animal instinct. Marriage, to him, was a prison that killed purity. His late views scandalized Russian society, infuriated his wife, and influenced radical Christian and pacifist movements worldwide. Tolstoy remains both admired and pitied, a man who crafted some of the world's greatest love stories, yet denounced love itself as a path to ruin.
Otto Weininger, an Austrian philosopher born in 1880, became infamous for a single book, Sex and Character, 1903. In it, he presented intensely misogynistic views that shocked even his contemporaries. Weininger argued that women lacked individuality and genius, living only through sexuality and motherhood. In his framework, marrying meant intellectual men surrendering their higher aims to the demands of women and family. Family life, he claimed, enslaved man to instincts, robbing him of philosophical greatness. He framed marriage as a tug of war, woman pulling man into mediocrity, man struggling for transcendence. Unsurprisingly, his ideas fueled stereotypes that painted women as obstacles to creativity. His book quickly became controversial but gained a cult following across Europe. Weininger's own life ended dramatically. Just months after publishing, at age 23, he rented the house where Beethoven had died and took his own life. This tragic act cemented his legend as the tortured young genius. Though rightly condemned today for misogyny, Weininger's work influenced thinkers from Wittgenstein to Strindberg. His philosophy turned marriage into an intellectual death sentence, an idea that still lingers whenever marriage is framed as the enemy of genius.
George Bernard Shaw, the brilliant Irish playwright and Nobel Prize winner, lived from 1856 to 1950 and practically turned mocking marriage into a sport. Unlike Tolstoy's thunder or Schopenhauer's bitterness, Shaw used wit. Though he never married, Shaw constantly skewered the institution. To him, matrimony was, in his words, two people under the harshest conditions trying to solve problems that never existed. He saw marriage not as love's triumph, but love's gravestone, a respectable cage people locked themselves into. His plays, like Getting Married and Man and Superman, poked fun at the hypocrisy of romantic ideals. Shaw believed passion cooled quickly and that social pressure, not romance, drove most weddings. Why then add legal contracts, financial obligations, and endless compromise? Yet, Shaw wasn't a recluse. He enjoyed rich friendships and intellectual circles, but he seemed to relish staying free of domestic routine. To him, marriage was the greatest comedy of human self-deception. Today, his mocking quips still go viral as memes, reminding us that even one of the 20th century's greatest wits thought matrimony was less happily ever after and more politely ever miserable.
August Strindberg. If Shaw treated marriage as comedy, August Strindberg, the Swedish playwright and novelist, 1849 to 1912, treated it as war. His own 3 marriages ended disastrously, and his pen turned rage into literature. Strindberg's plays, like The Father and Miss Julie, are filled with men and women locked in brutal psychological battles. For him, marriage wasn't compromise. It was a battlefield between sexes, each trying to dominate the other. He once called women parasites feeding off men's creativity. Unsurprisingly, critics often labeled him misogynistic. Strindberg's hostility sprang from personal scars. His wives accused him of paranoia and cruelty. He accused them of betrayal and manipulation. He framed family life as a suffocating trap that destroyed genius. And yet, audiences found his brutal honesty gripping. Strindberg dragged private domestic misery onto the public stage. To this day, his dramas feel raw and modern precisely because they expose the darker side of intimacy. His legacy is complicated. Hailed as a father of modern theater, condemned for hostility to women. Strindberg never saw marriage as a partnership, only as a duel, with scars on both sides.
Emil Cioran, the Romanian-born philosopher who lived much of his life in Paris, 1911 to 1995, made a career out of pessimism. If Schopenhauer said life was suffering, Cioran said yes, and even our cures for it are lies. Marriage, for Cioran, was one such lie. He believed attachment gave us the comforting illusion of stability, distracting from the abyss of existence. In aphorisms, he sneered that whatever joy people seek in wedlock is always temporary, eventually collapsing into disappointment. Cioran never married and lived a solitary life of night walks, insomnia, and writing. He viewed intense love as another narcotic, dulling the sheer despair of being alive. For him, clinging to family or spouse was just fear of emptiness dressed up as devotion. Unlike Strindberg's rage or Shaw's humor, Cioran's anti-marriage philosophy was mournful, not a storm, but a bleak whisper. He wasn't mocking love, he pitied it as one more trick life plays on us. His dark reflections still resonate with readers who see in him the courage to face despair without comfort. For Cioran, marriage wasn't sacred or sinful, it was simply another illusion hiding what we fear most, the void.
Simone Weil was a French philosopher and mystic. She lived a short but extraordinary life. Factory worker, frontline volunteer in the Spanish Civil War, and radical thinker on spirituality and justice. Unlike most philosophers here, Weil didn't rant about women or social decay. Instead, she believed the real enemy was the human ego. For Weil, attachments, romantic love, family duties, even national pride were snares that pulled the soul away from truth. Marriage symbolized this trap. People didn't truly love their spouse, she argued. They loved an image of themselves reflected in the other.
What looked like devotion was often attachment to ego. Her solution was radical: renounce clinging love and seek decreation, the stripping away of self so the divine might enter. In this light, marriage wasn't just risky, it was spiritually dangerous. Weil died young during World War II, weakened by self-denial, her mysticism leaving a haunting legacy. She's remembered as one who pursued purity at any cost, even rejecting attachments many see as essential to life. For Weil, love sanctified by marriage was not salvation, it was illusion, an obstacle that kept humanity from the divine.
Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, a French diplomat and controversial thinker, is best remembered for his racist essay on the inequality of human races. But buried in his writings, he also offered bitterly cynical comments on love and marriage. To him, matrimony was not uplifting, but corrosive. He believed marriage stripped people of individuality, binding them into petty conflicts, resentment, and disappointment. Far from uniting souls, it created endless arguments about duty, property, and children. In Gobineau's view, the household became a cage where ambition and freedom withered. His tone wasn't fiery like Nietzsche's or mocking like Shaw's. It was weary, almost bureaucratic, as though marriage was just another doomed human institution. He wrote of love fading into obligation, passion collapsing into irritation, and husbands and wives dragging each other down. This bleak realism mirrored his larger worldview. Human life was driven by decline, mixture, and compromise. Marriage, he thought, embodied that decay in miniature, starting with promise, ending in bitterness. Though his racial theories made him infamous, Gobineau's reflections on matrimony tapped into a long lineage of skepticism. For him, wedlock was no sacred bond at all, only a social trap where love and joy went to quietly die.